On the afternoon of April 10th, 1998, a 40-year-old woman named Diane Auget stood at a bar inside the Hayloft Tavern in the small town of Hudson, Florida. Diane grabbed her glass off the bar and downed the last few sips of her drink, and even though by this point her vision was blurry and she actually felt sick to her stomach, she still yelled out to the bartender in a very slurred voice and told him to bring her another round. And the reason for this is because Diane actively wanted to get so drunk that she could just forget everything. Because at the moment, her life was kind of a disaster. So Diane used to be a married, stay-at-home mother with 3 kids that she loved so much, but about 10 years ago, she'd begun having some very serious mental health problems, and she'd ultimately been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. She would fall into these deep depressions that would make it almost impossible to function. And then she would swing and have these manic episodes that would literally keep her up for days on end and left her so delirious that she would start talking to herself. Eventually, Diane's husband divorced her, and he got custody of their kids. Now, Diane's life had sort of leveled off. She was living with her sister, so she had some level of support, but her bipolar disorder really was not under control, in part because she had medication for it, but didn't always take it. And so she would swing in and out of mania and deep depressions all over again. And as a result of this, she had consistently been in and out of various psychiatric facilities multiple times. So on this particular night, Diane really just wanted to drown her sorrows. And so a couple of hours earlier, she had left her sister's house and walked to this bar because she didn't have a car. And she'd been standing around at this bar, basically pacing in circles and drinking alone ever since. Just then, the bartender came over. And even though Diane was seeing double, she immediately saw that he did not have another round in his hand. He had no more alcohol. The bartender gave Diane a look that was half annoyed and half sympathetic. And he told her he was cutting her off. And Diane was so mad. She began telling him that he didn't know what he was talking about, that this was humiliating, but he just put his hands up and said, "No, I'm sorry, you're cut off." And so eventually, very angrily, Diane turned and sort of stumbled out of the bar and began walking down the street. The next day, so April 11th, Diane's mother, Mildred, paced back and forth inside of her living room, holding a phone to her ear. It rang a couple of times, and then a dispatcher from the local police department picked up. At which point, Mildred told them in a shaky voice that she needed to report her daughter, Diane, missing. So a little while earlier, Mildred's other daughter, Diane's sister, the one that Diane lived with, had called to tell her that Diane had left the house the night before without telling her where she was going and still had not come home yet. And of course, based on Diane's history of mental illness and pretty erratic behavior, Mildred immediately felt like, oh my gosh, my daughter must be in trouble. So now, on the phone with police dispatch, Mildred explained the whole situation. She said that yes, it was possible that her daughter, Diane, had left and gone somewhere for some actual real purpose, but it was also entirely possible that she was having a manic episode and might have, in her mania, wandered off and gotten lost. The dispatcher said that she would send officers to interview Mildred and her other daughter, and they would start looking for Diane right away. But 4 days later, on April 15th, there was still no sign of Diane. That afternoon, Diane's mother, Mildred, checked in at the police station, like she had been every day since her daughter first went missing. But, just like always, the police didn't have any new information for her. So far, all they knew was on April 10th, the night Diane had left her sister's house without saying where she was going, they had figured out she had gone to the Hayloft Tavern and gotten so unbelievably drunk that the bartender had cut her off. And then at that point, she had walked out of the bar, and that was the last the bartender saw her. The following day, on April 11th, Diane had been sighted walking along Highway 19, which was just a couple of miles away from that tavern. And then she'd also been spotted near a locally owned motel right off the highway called the Coral Sands Motel. But after that, the police said they had no idea what happened to Diane, where she could have gone, or what could have happened to her. And so ultimately, Mildred left the police station feeling very disappointed and also scared. I mean, the whole drive back to her home, she felt absolutely sick with worry. She had no idea if her daughter was hiding somewhere on purpose, or if she'd gotten lost and was now injured, or maybe she was hungry, or if she'd maybe run into the wrong person and potentially been kidnapped, or worse. I mean, there's all these terrible scenarios playing out in her head. Finally, Mildred got back home and she went inside, And she sat down on her couch and just tried to think about, what else she could do to find her daughter. And that's when she noticed she had a new voicemail on her answering machine. Mildred thought, maybe her other daughter had called while she was out and that was the voicemail. Or maybe it's something to do with Diane. But either way, she got up, she walked over, and she hit play. And what she heard made her feel sick to her stomach. What she heard was Diane's voice. And Diane sounded terrified. And she kept saying, "Help! Let me out!" Then there was sort of a scuffling sound on the recording, like somebody had grabbed the phone out of Diane's hand. And then Diane said something like, "Hey, give me that." And then the call just cut off. And so after hearing this, Mildred obviously went into a total panic. It's like, oh my gosh, all of the worst things that could have happened to my daughter must be happening. And so now, even though Mildred was completely upset, she's shaking with anxiety and fear, she grabbed the answering machine and looked for the caller ID to see, who left this message. But all it said was the call had come in from somewhere called Starlight, which didn't mean anything to Mildred. But she quickly, dialed this number back, hoping, whoever it was would pick up, but nobody answered. And so after that, Mildred called the police. This voicemail made it obvious to police that Diane had not left on purpose and she was not lost. It sounded like, at least based on this voicemail, that she had been kidnapped and was likely being held against her will. But as for where Diane was being held, the police had no idea. They couldn't trace the call to her specific location, and they couldn't figure out what this Starlight thing was either. So for another full day or so, the investigation, despite this new lead, basically floundered. There wasn't much to go on. That is, until the next afternoon, on April 16th, so 5 days after Diane disappeared. On that day, the police got a call from a man who said he had just been walking along the side of Highway 19 and he had found something disturbing. He said he wasn't sure if the object was even real, but he thought, for sure the police should probably come check it out just in case. And so police immediately rushed out to the scene. They found this object, they sent it off for testing, and then they waited. And when the analysis came back, they learned two things. Number one, the object was definitely real. And number two, it belonged to Diane Ogget. The object was the severed tip of a finger from her right hand. Over the next few years, people kept calling in sightings of Diane Ogget to the police in Florida. And the police would look into it, and they would interview more than 100 people. But nothing ever panned out. The police never figured out what Starlight was, which is where that voicemail had originated from that was left on her mother's voicemail. And the police also never determined how or why Diane's finger was cut off. But despite all that, strange clues that definitely were tied to Diane kept turning up in some very strange places. Like, for example, the manager of a convenience store near where Diane lived found a bag of Diane's neatly folded clothing inside of their store's outdoor freezer. And a customer at a different nearby convenience store found a plastic bag full of toiletries, including eyeliner and perfume and lipstick, that was left behind on a countertop. And on it was scrawled the name Diane. But police were never able to figure out who placed the bag or why. And so unfortunately, today, Diane's case remains unsolved. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. Sometimes I think about being a kid, riding in the back seat at night, street lights flashing across the window, no responsibilities, no real fear of the future. Well, if I could say something to that little kid version of me, I'd probably say, you're gonna be okay, but don't rush it. Don't wish this away. Because when things get hard, it's easy to start looking backwards. Nostalgia is basically a highlight reel. And then you look at your present and it doesn't stand a chance. Here's the thing though, the life you are living right now, you're going to feel nostalgic for this someday. And so if you spend it longing for something that's already gone, you'll miss it twice. If reaching for the past is getting in the way of living now, therapy may help you figure out what you're actually looking for. And it might also help you to start finding more of that in the present. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. Take the quiz and get matched with a credentialed therapist quickly, and switch anytime at no extra cost if it's not the right fit. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen and get 10% off your first month of therapy. Around 3:30 p.m. on December 17, 1927, a 21-year-old sailor named Joe Stevens stood inside of a U.S. Navy submarine that was cruising underwater in Cape Cod Bay, about a mile off the coast of Massachusetts. Joe was at the front of the submarine, inside of a small windowless compartment called the torpedo room. It was about 20 feet long by 10 feet wide, and on one side, there was a metal door that was open that led out to the rest of the submarine. The walls were lined with 6 bunks, a bunch of machinery, and also several torpedoes. And Joe was absolutely thrilled to be in this submarine, because Joe had always dreamed of working on a sub. When he was a kid, he'd actually made this fake periscope out of wood, which on a submarine, the periscope is like a set of binoculars, if you will, that kind of juts up above the submarine, and the submarine can rise just close to the surface, but right below, and the periscope perches kind of just barely out of the water, and it can look around to show you what else is nearby. And so with this fake periscope, Joe and his older sister Florence would spend hours and hours as kids pretending they were on a submarine deep underwater on all sorts of special missions. And so years later, when Joe turned 18, the first thing he did is he enlisted in the Navy. And recently, he had finally been assigned to actually working on this submarine. And it was really like, his childhood dream had finally come true. On this particular day, Joe was doing one of his very first test sails. Basically, he and the other 40 men on board the sub were just testing out all the different machinery on board to make sure everything was working correctly. And so Joe and 5 other men had been assigned specifically to work in the torpedo room. They stood by inside of this room and waited for a command from their captain to come through on the one-way intercom overhead. But as they're standing there, just sort of waiting around, sort of out of nowhere, Joe heard this grating, loud, metallic sound that kind of echoed through the whole submarine. In fact, the sub itself shook so hard during this sound that Joe and the others fell to the ground. And so immediately, Joe and his coworkers are scrambling to get to their feet. They're looking at each other like, what was that? But then it was like their worst nightmare began to play out, as water began to rush through that open door from the rest of the submarine into the torpedo room. And so as this absolutely horrifying scenario is playing out, Joe, his immediate reaction is actually this overwhelming sense of deja vu. Like, just for a second, he felt like, I've experienced this exact moment before. But before he could actually process this feeling, a couple of his coworkers rushed past him and managed to slam that door that connected the torpedo room to the rest of the submarine. They shut it and they sealed it. And so at this point, Joe has sort of snapped back to reality. He's not thinking about the deja vu thing. He's like, okay, what's going on? I mean, he realized there must have clearly been some kind of accident. I mean, basically everybody thought the same thing. That sound, the grating sound, the shaking in the water, I mean, that screams something has struck the torpedo, something's happened. He expected the captain's voice to come over the intercom, not to talk about the test run they were actually on here, but with orders about what they should do now that there was a real-world emergency playing out. And so for a couple of minutes, Joe and his fellow sailors just kind of sat there in this, sealed-off torpedo room waiting for this announcement. But there was nothing. And then Joe and the others felt a jolt, as if the submarine had just settled at the bottom of the bay. At first, Joe and the 5 other sailors didn't panic. Whatever had happened, they knew clearly it was not good, but they also figured, maybe this was not a total emergency. It was bad, but maybe we can salvage this. After all, they were only about, 1 mile away from the nearest Coast Guard station. And even though Joe and the others inside the torpedo room did not have a way to actually reach out from where they were to the Coast Guard station, or anyone else for that matter, to call for help, they figured that somebody else in the other parts of the submarine would be able to punch out and call to the Coast Guard station and call for help. But the minutes turned into hours, and there was no progress. There was no obvious sign that any sort of rescue was underway. They didn't hear anything over the intercom. They couldn't even hear anything on the other side of the door. They figured by now one of their comrades would have come over and knocked on the door or in some way talked to them. But no, it's just silence. and also the emergency lights inside the torpedo room eventually flickered out. They're very likely on the bottom of the bay in this sealed room in total darkness. They also had no food and no water. That was in the other part of the submarine, but they couldn't open the door without risking more water coming in. So they're just totally trapped. Now, of course, all of that was horrible. For Joe and the others, they knew how dire this situation was. But the scariest part of the whole situation was that they knew there was a finite amount of oxygen inside of this sealed room. And with every breath they took in, they were using up that air supply. And so pretty soon, this tiny metal torpedo room was starting to feel more like an underwater coffin. Joe began fading in and out of sleep. He sort of lost track of time, and he also was starting to lose hope. But then suddenly, Joe heard this loud, metallic clanging sound. And he realized someone was knocking on the outside of the submarine, like their rescue had clearly begun. And so Joe and the others immediately jumped out of their bunk, sort of knocking into each other because they can't see each other, and they went over to begin knocking back, signaling to whoever was out there that, hey, we're alive, we're still in here. By using Morse code, which is a method of communication via tapping, Joe was able to actually communicate with these folks outside the submarine. And he did confirm they were Coast Guard rescue divers, and they told Joe what happened. They explained that about 16 hours earlier, a Coast Guard ship had struck their submarine, it punctured the submarine, it sank, and everybody else, minus Joe and his people inside of the torpedo room, had all drowned. And so now the rescue divers were here to rescue Joe and the other people he was with. Now, when Joe and the others heard this news, this was horrifying, but also they're thinking, wow, had we not sealed that door as fast as we had, we would be dead. Like, we are so lucky to be alive. And so Joe, after hearing this message, he began frantically knocking back a message, basically saying like, well, great, but when are you going to get us out of here? Because we're running out of air. It's getting hard to breathe in here. But the rescue divers could only tell him that they were doing their best and they would get them up as soon as possible. And this was definitely true. The Coast Guard was genuinely doing everything they could as quickly as they could to save Joe and the others. But the reality was, this was a really difficult problem to solve. You have people that are trapped inside of an air pocket deep underwater. If you open up any section of this air pocket, any section of the submarine, water will rush in so quickly that the pressure alone of that water rushing in would literally kill everybody inside. So that wasn't an option. You also have the fact that, as Joe said, they're running out of air. You have this compressed timeline to figure it out. And so really what it leaves you with is, okay, you need to basically quickly lift up the submarine, keeping everybody inside of it, and raise it to the surface. But this is in 1927. This is like a complicated thing to do with modern day technology, let alone 100 years ago. But that was sort of like their best chance, is bring in multiple ships with all these different strange lifts and somehow scoop the submarine and raise it to the surface before everybody inside suffocated. But the problem was, when they actually began organizing all these ships to try to lift up the submarine, there was this huge storm on the surface with really high winds that just battered the area, making it nearly impossible to position the different lifts off these ships. And unfortunately, this storm was going to be raging for days. And so while this catastrophe was playing off the coast of Massachusetts, about 100 miles away in Providence, Rhode Island, Joe's older sister, Florence, opened up a newspaper and read yet another article about the sunken submarine, where she knew her brother was trapped. For the last couple of days, Florence had been absolutely glued to her radio and the newspaper, desperate to hear or read some good news. But every article and every news segment, they said the same thing. The 6 men who were trapped inside the sub were definitely still alive. They were communicating with the divers, but the storm on the surface was still just too intense to rescue them. Florence felt so scared for her brother, and not just because the situation itself was objectively dangerous, but also because she remembered the submarine game that she and Joe used to play when they were little. And more specifically, she remembered the very last time they had ever played it. Joe had been about 4 years old, and the two of them had just finished another one of their make-believe missions, and they were supposed to be bringing their imaginary submarine back up to the surface. But then Joe had suddenly dropped his homemade wooden periscope, and he turned to Florence and said something so strange and so haunting for such a young child. that Florence had never forgotten it. She had asked him to clarify and explain what he meant, but he had refused. And in fact, after this, he refused to play the submarine game ever again. Now, Florence hadn't thought about this in years, but now that she's seeing what's happening with her brother, it was all she could think about. A couple of days later, on December 22nd, so 5 days after the submarine had sunk, Florence received word that her brother Joe and all the other sailors in the torpedo room had died while waiting to be rescued. And Florence was totally grief-stricken. I mean, this was her baby brother who's just died in this horrible way. But also, strangely, for like the first time in her life, she felt like she actually understood what Joe had said all those years earlier when he was 4 years old, when they had played that last game of submarine. On that day, after dropping his periscope, he had turned to Florence and said, quote, "All hands were lost." This is an expression that's used in the Navy to mean everybody on board died, meaning their make-believe submarine had just sunk and everyone on board had died. And remember, after he said this, Florence tried to get, 4-year-old Joe to explain what he meant, but he wouldn't, and then he refused to play it ever again. And so now, in hindsight, Florence believed that her 4-year-old brother had predicted his own death. On the evening of April 19th, 1989, a 62-year-old man named Thomas Meehan was sitting in his living room in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, watching some TV when his phone rang. Thomas picked up and said hello, and he heard his daughter, Patricia, on the other end. And right away, he could tell by Patricia's voice that she was feeling really down, which actually didn't surprise him. So Patricia was 37 years old, and Thomas knew she'd really been struggling lately. She lived almost 2,000 miles away from Pittsburgh in Bozeman, Montana, where she worked as a ranch hand. Now, she liked her job, mostly because she loved the animals, but she just had a really hard time getting along with people, and so she was sort of lonely. She didn't really have a lot of close friends, and recently she'd been through a breakup, and even though she'd always loved kids, she'd never had any of her own. And so to Thomas, it seemed like his daughter was just going through, basically a midlife crisis. And so as Thomas is listening to his daughter, just kind of, talking about her life generally and just sort of making small talk, he sort of cut through and just said, "Hey, what's going on? Like, how are you doing?" And Patricia, she stopped and then sort of vaguely said that she was just under a lot of stress and that she was thinking about quitting her job and moving away from Bozeman. And she actually asked her dad if he'd be okay with her coming to Pittsburgh and maybe moving back in with him. And Thomas, who adored his daughter and really felt for her, immediately was like, "Of course, you can come home anytime you want." This definitely lightened Patricia's mood. And then she told her dad that she'd call him back the next day to make more solid plans. And then she said she loved him and she hung up. But the next day, Thomas did not get a call from Patricia. In fact, he never got another call from his daughter again. The following day, so April 20th at about 8:15 p.m., 1,500 miles away from Thomas's house in Pittsburgh, a woman named Carol Heights was driving down a very isolated 2-lane highway in the rural town of Circle, Montana. It was dark and cold outside, and all Carol could see was the one car driving in front of her. And beyond that, there was just big empty fields on either side of the highway. But, sort of out of nowhere, this car, which had just been putting along at the same speed as Carol, it suddenly swerved off the road. For a second, Carol was just so confused, like what caused the car to suddenly veer out of the way? But then a split second later, Carol understood exactly what had happened. Because right in front of her was another car driving the wrong way, barreling down on her. And so Carol, she jammed on the brakes and she tried to swerve out of the way, same as this other car had, but she wasn't fast enough. And this other car smashed into her, basically head on. Carol felt her head snap back. There was this loud metallic crunching sound and then blackness. But then just a couple of minutes later, Carol opened her eyes and realized she had survived the crash. I mean, she felt, pain in her neck and her car's a mess. The airbags have deployed. Like, obviously she's been in a serious wreck, but she's alive. And so eventually Carol managed to open up her door and she climbed out, with the intention of actually checking on the other driver because the other car that smashed into her is basically butted up against her and she can't really tell the status of this person. So she gets out and she's going over to see if this person's okay. But before she reached the other car, the other driver also climbed out of their car, and in the light from both cars' headlights, Carol could see that this other person was a middle-aged woman who appeared to have shoulder-length strawberry blonde hair. And this woman, didn't appear to be hurt, at least on the surface. In fact, weirdly, she seemed very, very calm. And this woman, she just stood there by her car, not saying a word to Carol or in any way recognizing what she had just done, which is drive the wrong way and smash into Carol. Could have killed Carol. No recognition of that. Instead, she just stood there, and then eventually she turned and just stared at Carol. And this was sort of alarming to Carol, and it caused her to just stop and also just stand there staring at this woman, not really sure what to do. And as Carol is waiting to see what they're going to do, the other driver, this middle-aged woman, just turned and started walking away. At this point, Carol yelled to her to stop. You can't go. We had this horrible accident. We have to wait for authorities to get here. You can't just leave. But this woman, she didn't even look back to talk to Carol. She just calmly walked off the highway and then climbed over a fence into one of those big empty fields on the side of the road and just kept on walking until Carol couldn't see her anymore. She just vanished. When the police arrived about 45 minutes later at 9 p.m., they found the wreck and they found Carol, and this other driver again was just gone. And so they ran the license plate of the other car, the one that hit Carol's, and they learned that it was registered to 37-year-old Patricia Meehan. But beyond the fact that apparently Patricia had just wandered off here, the other weird thing about this was the registration showed that Patricia lived 400 miles away. So they really weren't sure what she was even doing all the way out here. Now, Patricia did not come back to the crash site, and so eventually police got canine units out there and they began looking for her. And they were able to find a trail of her footprints out in that field. And they followed that trail for hours and hours, but eventually the footprints just stopped and the dogs lost her scent. Now, police would continue looking for Patricia for nearly a week with no luck. They never found another trace of Patricia. It really was like she wandered into that field and just sort of vanished. But that was not the end of the story. Because about 2 weeks later, a totally unrelated police officer was eating at a fast food restaurant in Laverne, Minnesota, which was about 700 miles away from the crash site. Now, even though this officer lived and worked in a completely different state, they'd actually heard about Patricia Meehan's disappearance and seen pictures of her because her case was now national news. So when this officer looked across the restaurant he was in and saw a middle-aged woman with strawberry blonde hair sitting in a booth by herself, silently drinking water and just staring off into space, he immediately recognized her as Patricia. Now, the police officer had no idea if this really was Patricia. He was confident it was, but this just seems so random and so bizarre that she would be here, of all places. He also didn't know if this person was alone or not, or what she was even trying to do. So instead of getting up and going and talking to her, he just stayed in his seat and kept an eye on her. And for the next 5 hours, the woman he believed was Patricia just sat there in the booth, slowly drinking water, just staring off into space for 5 hours. Eventually, the restaurant closed, at which point an employee had to tell this woman to get up and go. They also told the officer that he too had to leave. And so after the officer and this woman who he thought was Patricia had left this restaurant, the officer kind of hung back and continued watching the woman, and she just went right across the street to a diner. And this time, the officer did not keep his distance. He went inside the diner, and he went right over to where she was sitting at a table, and he sat down next to her, and he just said, "What's your name?" And for a moment, the woman seemed kind of confused why, this random police officer was even sitting with her to begin with. But instead of, challenging the police officer, she just went quiet for a second, and then in a sort of hushed voice, she said that she was from Colorado. But then a moment later, she shook her head and said, "Actually, no, I'm from Israel." And then, before she gave up any more information, like her name or why she was here or anything, she jumped up out of her seat and ran outside. And the police officer was kind of caught off guard by this and was a little bit slow to get up and chase after her. But he ran outside too, and by the time he got out there, she had disappeared. Over the next month or so, The police in charge of Patricia's case received dozens of reports like this from people who believed they saw Patricia at restaurants and truck stops all over America. And the police actually confirmed many of these sightings, meaning they believed that these witnesses really did see Patricia. It was not just some lookalike. And in every case, witnesses reported that this woman, presumably Patricia, refused to speak and was just staring vacantly into space. She didn't seem to know who she was or what she was even doing. But also, in every one of these cases, before anybody could intervene or ask her questions or just help her in some way, Patricia would run off and disappear again. It was like Patricia was a ghost, appearing and disappearing over and over again all over the country. As of today, there have been over 5,000 reported sightings of Patricia Meehan. But still, we do not know where she is. Her case still today is open and unsolved.